So I am really excited to be chairing this session. My name is Paul Durst. I am in the program for the communication of science and technology here at Vanderbilt, and I'm also the assistant director of the STEM training and education program. So this is a subject near and dear to my heart. We'll be talking about teaching evolution. And so our first speaker will be Gale Sinatra from the University of Southern California, and she's going to be talking to us about science denialism.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers, Antonius, Glenn, Andy, for inviting a psychologist to a biology conference. It's a deep honor to be here. Title of my talk, Science Denial, Why It's a Problem for Teaching About Evolution and What to Do About It. This work comes from my collaborative book with Dr. Barbara Hofer called Science Denial, Why It Happens, What to Do About It. Brianna has a copy in her bag of my book and everyone else's book in this room. It's a magic bag. If you want to see it, she'll show you. So to start, what I really talk about in the book is science denial, but also doubt and resistance. And one thing that people really don't understand is it's not an us or them. People often think there's a group of science deniers and then there's a group of science acceptors, and that's not really how it works. It's not really an us or them thing. Even ourselves as scientists can be doubtful of a finding. So let's get some definitions. Denial, full-blown, is a belief-based stance. But it's actually rare. It's a rejection of science like climate change is a hoax, the earth is flat, vaccines cause autism. But doubt and resistance are much, much more common. So especially with findings that don't fit your personal beliefs, that conflict with your social identity, or that require deeper analysis. People in here will be shocked to learn not everyone is a deep thinker. Cafeteria denial is in fact very common, and this is where you pick and choose what you want to believe. People fly to the Flat Earth Convention and then text about it on their iPhone, and they really don't see any contradiction in that set of activities. Skepticism, however, is healthy. Scientists are and should be skeptical. I read about a study that said postmenopausal women lose weight if they eat chocolate, and I thought, awesome study. Turned out it had no control group and 25 participants, and I was like, maybe it's not as awesome. So in general, we would argue in the book, and we do argue, that democratic societies really depend on citizens to make informed decisions about scientific issues because they affect their own lives and the lives of others, and for the good of their own health and well-being and their communities, their nation, their planet. You want to turn your students into scientists, and please do. We need them, but not everyone needs to be a scientist, but I think everyone needs to have some level of scientific thinking in their life. So the issues that affect people are vaccinations, climate change. We just heard about GMOs. I'm so glad that that came up, and obviously evolution. But there are problems with evaluating scientific claims and understanding the premises of science. This is very challenging for students. You've seen it in your classrooms. It's particularly challenging for people who have not had a lot of science. And there's a huge disconnect between scientists' opinions and the general public's opinions. Is it safe to eat GMOs? Is the earth warming that we're experiencing due mostly to human activity currently? And have humans and other living organisms evolved over time? Here is the Pew disparate opinions between scientists and the public on those matters. So what our book does is talks about the psychological explanations for science, doubt, denial, and resistance. And I'm going to talk about these 5 very briefly today. Mental shortcuts, motivated reasoning, emotions and attitudes, social identity, and epistemic cognition. I'm going to start with mental shortcuts. So what are those? Those are thinking and reasoning biases or cognitive biases. You've probably heard of several of these. For example, we have a tendency to rely on what's called System 1 thinking. If you've heard of thinking fast and slow, that's the quick intuitive judgment. We tend to do that much more than think analytically. Confirmation bias, I'm sure you've all heard of. That's seeking, interpreting, and recalling information that aligns with your pre-existing beliefs, confirms what you already know or already think you know. Availability heuristic, believing that information we have available to us is the right information. Years back, there was a big snowstorm in DC, and famously, Senator Inhofe brought a snowball onto the Senate floor to claim that climate change was a hoax because it snowed in DC. Essentialism, which you're all familiar with, I would call a cognitive bias. Motivated reasoning, you've probably all heard that term, and what happens is that motivations can bias understanding because it can help us to decide what evidence to accept and what conclusions are preferred, and that is not the way you want to reason about science. Individuals are much more critical of the methodology of a research study if they don't like the outcome. And accepting evidence of non-human animal evolution as opposed to human evolution would be an example of that. Identity can motivate our reasoning, and in fact does. So if your community or your faith-based group is anti-science, you are much, much more likely to be anti-science. Emotions and attitudes. I want to share a quick study we did quite a long time ago because it's illustrative of some of the things we've been talking about over the course of these last 2 days, and that is, how can you make students realize that evolution is not a thing in the past, but it affects our lives today? Some of the talks today particularly emphasize that. And this is a technique that I've used with a colleague based on teaching for transformative experience developed by Kevin Pugh. It's a science education model. And what it does is it helps students use the concepts they're learning in class outside of the classroom. And there's a long explanation of how we do this, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about it later. But you help students see evolution and see it differently. And you help them realize the value, and you do this through sharing your own transformative experiences. So we did this by pitting misconceptions about evolution based on essentialism with a more scientific conception. We did this with college students, and to make a long story short, when you instruct students to go out and find examples of evolution in their day-to-day life, they change their conceptions about what evolution is, and they enjoy it. Who knew evolution could be fun? Here's some examples from students that represent these 3 pillars of teaching for transformative experience. Active use. Some students, when they came back after looking for evolution in their lives, said, when I was at the zoo, I thought about variation when I looked at elephants, because African elephants are taller and have larger ears. Expansion of perception. How do you perceive things differently and broaden your ideas about evolution? I never thought I was related to a plant, one student said. Experiential value. How do you value this information in your own daily lives? Because of natural selection, I'm more aware of what amazing species I belong to. So, some of the emotional factors that people can experience when learning about evolution. Social identity. We've talked about that a lot today and tomorrow and the next day, and we're going to be talking about it quite a lot. How do students make sense of scientific claims in what is now our digital world? And how do individuals decide what knowledge to accept as valid? Your in-group identity influences your views on science, and when you identify with a group that questions the age of the Earth or questions human evolution, you are more likely to believe that. It's been shown that people are much more likely to believe science articles posted by a friend on Facebook than a science article posted by an expert. and we all live in our social media bubbles. And this, along with many other factors, has contributed to an erosion of trust in expertise. And it turns out that evolution skeptics are way better at persuasion. Scientists don't consider themselves in the persuasion business, but maybe they should be. Social media is dominated by influencers and science skeptics, and they're often selling products. Supplement business is a billion-dollar business. That's a technical term. And then right-leaning media trends anti-science. Joe Rogan is just asking questions. Epistemic cognition, what's that? Well, you all know, and probably have to teach this in your intro science classes, that AAAS would say that the natural world is understandable through systematic study. Science cannot provide complete answers to all questions, but scientific knowledge is durable. And scientific ideas are subject to change. These facts about science are not well known, not well understood, even by science students. This one in particular is very vexing for people. Individuals confuse tentativeness for uncertainty all the time. We saw this in COVID. You lied. You said we didn't need masks. Wasn't lying. It was a novel virus. So, as information changed, so did the science. That's the strength of science, and people saw it as the weakness. So, what does epistemic cognition have to do with understanding science? Epistemic cognition is how do individuals think and reason about knowledge and knowing? Where does knowledge come from? And this is very important when you have competing truth claims. You should wear a mask, you should not wear a mask. We're evolved from other animals, we're not. And there's a developmental trajectory of this over humans' development. Young children start out as absolutists, and so they may believe there's, should be a missing link, and scientists don't have a complete fossil record, and they don't know everything, ergo it's very uncertain. As they get older, they may enter this common stage of multiplism, which means, all knowledge is tentative, so all claims are equally good, and so why shouldn't intelligent design or young earth creationism just be another opinion? They're all equally informative and valid. But as students evolve, they might make it to the state of evaluativism, a word I can never pronounce correctly. And this is a sense of the relative nature of uncertainty in science and in knowledge, and the criteria for how to evaluate knowledge claims and sources of authority and the use of evidence. And as we know, not everyone in society reaches this stage, even those with education, and probably some PhD students also. And that brings us to another challenging problem, and that's epistemic trust. Who do you trust? What sources of knowledge do you trust? We know there's been a decline in trust of authorities and experts over time, and we know that COVID exacerbated mistrust. Do you think Fauci's a hero or a villain? That depends on what your social identity group thinks. Now, I want to be clear, there's some reason for distrust that's really legitimate, particularly among communities of color who've been historically marginalized from medical and scientific research and treatment. But, don't worry, you don't need to read this graph, just look at the dark blue. Trust was low pre-pandemic, but it dropped further during COVID. Trust is down for medical scientists, for public school principals, you can guess why, school closures, elected officials, and the numbers for those who have a great deal of trust, which is the dark blue, are very low. In the 30s, 20s, and single digits for politicians. At least scientists are beating them out. Why has epistemic trust eroded? Well, there's been a systematic effort on the part of politicians and other bad actors to erode public's trust in government, in higher education, and Western medicine, primarily on the politically right, but not exclusively. It's happened also on the political left. Childhood vaccines were trusted by Republicans prior to COVID. Mississippi had the largest childhood vaccination rate, the best childhood vaccination rate pre-COVID, and now not so much. Health influencers, often from the political left, are against eating GMOs, against maybe vaccines, and just, eat organic, or they sell natural remedies. I'm not a huge fan of Tom Nichols, but I'm a huge fan of this quote of his. The foundational knowledge of the average American is now so low that it has crashed through the floor of uninformed, past misinformed on the way down, and now is plummeting to aggressively wrong. And I do think the aggressively wrong part is what we're seeing quite a bit of right now. So, what can we do? I normally have a slide on what individuals can do, but I skipped that because you already know and accept science. But what can educators do? Because many of you are educators, and this isn't just for K through 12, but in K through 12, enhance your own scientific understanding. Teach about the nature of science. I know most of you probably do that, but not all science instructors do that. Foster scientific thinking in all students, not just science majors. Teach real-world applications of science. We saw an excellent presentation right before the break about how if we understand plant pathology, we might feed more people. There's lots of really great examples out there. Let students choose areas of inquiry, but most importantly, be aware of strong beliefs, attitudes, and identities in your students. I mentioned that I once talked to an evolutionary biology teacher in university who said he'd never encountered anyone who had any trouble with evolution. And I was like, how do you know that? And he said, well, they've never brought it up to me. I think maybe he wasn't sure that. Anyway, recognize students' emotions. Students don't often share their emotions with their professors, but they are feeling them. So, what else can educators do? They can also foster digital literacy. That's something that I'm working on. I have an NSF grant that has not yet been canceled. Yay. Teaching teachers to teach students how to source accurate scientific information online. I'd love to tell you about that research. Just ask me later. Now, what can you do? Because you all are science communicators, whether you realize it or not. Please, and I'm begging you, please write about your science that you are doing right now for the general public. There's a great outlet called The Conversation. If you don't know it, get familiar with it. They publish articles by scientists for the general public. How many of you know The Conversation? It's wonderful. I've published 4 articles in there, and I have over 435,000 reads of that, and I can tell you for certain that all my 100-plus journal articles have never gotten that kind of readership. Please write for the general public. Please write about not only what you know, but how you know it. That's the part that's missing in most science journalism. If you see science journalism, it's often, here's this new finding. How did you find that out? Know your audience's misconceptions. We've been talking about that a lot. I once went to a Arctic Polar Research Conference, and I asked the Arctic researchers, what are the misconceptions about your field that your students have? And they said, we don't know. That's a problem, because they do have them. Think about their attitudes, their motivations, their emotions, their identities. How do you know these things? Ask them. They will be more than happy to tell you. Provide the evidence for the claims. When you talk to the general public, again, not just the claim, the evidence that's much more convincing. Both sides is terrible. That's for opinions, not for science. These, Bill Nye, the science guy, debating a creationist, terrible idea. What can policymakers do? We used to have science advisors. That was a thing. Hire and listen to science advisors. That would be great. Support education standards that emphasize how to think over what to think. And we really need to push back on this trend of ignoring the factual basis of claims. And I would argue we need to demand more rigorous preparation of teachers' beliefs when you assess them. They are no different than the general public. K-12 teachers don't know any more about science than your average citizen. That's tragic. And then, this is a pipe dream, hope that social media becomes more transparent, accountable, and responsible. Yeah, this slide is a little bit old, isn't it? Thank you.